to Two Lit Ladies, the podcast. The Two Lit Ladies, Dr. Katherine McKnight and Deanna Gallagher, are literacy experts and educators who specialize in developing reading, writing, and literacy skills for all students. Thank you for tuning in.
Hi, welcome to Two Lit Ladies. I'm here with my colleague. This is Katherine McKnight with
Deanna Gallagher.
We are the Two Lit
Ladies.
Yeah. And we have a special guest today, Jenn Marshall. And title of this podcast is Warning, This Could Get Graphic. Jenn Marshall is a middle school teacher in Kennewick, Washington at Highlands Middle School. And she is an expert truly on graphic novels. Graphic novels are not only part of her classroom and teaching and what she does to inspire kids to become lifelong readers, but also in her family too. So we want to get ready and have a great conversation about graphic novels with the awesome Jenn Marshall.
Woot,
so
woot.
Hi, Jenn. Yay. Woo, woo, woo.
Hey, guys.
Yeah. So we're just coming off of summer vacation. And right before we started recording, we were talking about our adventures in summer vacation. But, you know, I want to talk about graphic novels. And, you know, since I've been a teacher and they're more accepted now, it seems, in the classroom. And I just like to just kind of have an overall chat about you teach ELA, but you also teach reading intervention. So you have kids who are struggling readers, reluctant readers, and just we're all, you know, parents of teenagers as well, mothers of teenagers, of just, you know, what is the role of graphic novels in a rich reading life with kids?
And it's funny that you say that they're more accepted, because I feel like that's the case too right now. Like, they are definitely out there more. But on Twitter 2 days ago, a parent posted the letter that came home from her child's school. They just, you know, you get those, this is what, like the syllabus and all that stuff. And it says, your child can read anything except comic books and ebooks.
Oh,
and so
wow.
Now this is where we, as you know, the listeners are going, boo. Yeah.
So the happy ending to this story is a bunch of big name comic writers, like the guy who's writing Detective Comics, which is a Batman story, the girl who created Kamala Khan, who's Miss Marvel. They all are banding together saying, come on, everybody, find the research, send this parent research. Let's fix this teacher.
Oh, yeah. And
Very
let's
nice.
crowdsource a great research body. Wow.
Yeah.
What a fortunate outcome. So what did they put together? What kinds of things did they send forward?
So they had a lot of teachers that kind of came on and said, you know, this is how we do it in class. I did a post that's been getting reshared about using comics and picture books in class because it's lots of practice. And a few articles that were getting shared about like why comics are so important, just kind of showing, just because it has pictures, it doesn't mean it's not, you know, more adult or more complicated, or, you know, a lot of the argument is that they're not complex because they don't have very many words.
Well, maybe that's a good place for you to start then, talking about.
Yeah, why don't can we? Yeah, I was just going to say let's start there, but you know, let's talk about it from a purely educational, like reading standpoint first, right. Okay? And here's the thing: is that one of the reasons why graphic novels are so powerful is that images are paired with text with quite complex ideas, and the images give an overview of the story, and they don't replace the language, but they supplement the language. And, you know, for all readers, anything like that, where you have imagery that's paired with language really promotes the development of higher level comprehension skills. And also that the language is also very high quality as well in graphic novels, because of course you have to be so economical with language. So the language has to be very precise in graphic novels. And the other thing that it teaches kids too is that graphic novels are meant to be read more than once. And so we're promoting kids to reread text as well. And how about the fact that they're engaging and interesting and, a seminal graphic novel like Mouse has a powerful, powerful message about the Holocaust that is quite far reaching, that is different than just
right. It won a Pulitzer.
So yeah, exactly. So what would you add to that, Jen, especially, with your expertise in reading and such, what does a graphic novel do that a regular text, and I put regular text in quotation marks because graphic novels are text as well. What's the difference? What does it do that regular text doesn't do?
One of the things that I like the most about comic books is if you fly through the graphic novel or the comic and you only read the words, you don't get the whole story. If you fly through and you only look at the pictures, you don't get the story. You have to use both to connect the two of them together. One without the other is only half the story. And so we recognize the need for visuals in history class. We recognize the need for visuals. Like our district is a big GLAD district that, there's lots of pictures and lots of, we recognize that that's important. But then you see teachers saying that comic books you can't read, they're not real books because they have pictures. The pictures let kids get unstuck, that maybe they're not familiar with a word, or it brings like a concept home a little bit clearer because you can picture it in your head. It's right there, so it's not as big of a jump for some kids. And I think the fact that there's not a lot of words, I know for my kiddos, they tend to like that idea. Like, oh, look, there's hardly any words. I can fly through this, get my credit, and I'm done. But they take just as long to read a graphic novel as they do a traditional novel because there's so many pictures and you get hung up in it takes you a few minutes for each panel sometimes if they're big, complex stories. But
there's a density to it that I think a lot of lay people don't understand.
Yes. And I also think that a number of us that read these days, maybe having come from more homogenous backgrounds where we didn't have classrooms that were filled with non-native speakers in our classroom, we don't understand how invaluable those kinds of cues are and those kinds of supports are for students whose first language is not English.
Yeah. Yeah. And I always say this too, especially when we're talking about older readers, like in middle school and high school, that, this is the Google generation. And I always joke and say, notice that Evelyn Wood speed reading is out of business, right? So kids can skim text, actually. That's one of their superpowers right now. So when you ask them, what's the main idea? They can usually find it because they know physically where it's supposed to be in the text. But instead, if you really want to check for comprehension, with middle school and high school kids, ask them, what did you see? What did you hear when you're reading? And that's one of the things that I really like about graphic novels is that it really promotes visualization when reading and also auditory because you're using, getting that voice in your head because of it's very clear who's talking, which characters are talking, who's narrating, that sort of thing. And we do that in early literacy. That's why we have picture books, right? When kids are younger, is it teaches them to develop that inner voice, that inner sight while they're reading. But when we get into more complex ideas and texts, we go away from that. And I think that's one of the things that it promotes. So it's not just for struggling readers or reluctant readers. My daughter and, Deanna's son and your daughter too, Jen, they're all really proficient, excellent readers. And my daughter, her entree into graphic novels was reading Shakespeare. She read original Shakespeare as graphic novels when she was in 5th grade. And that was her exposure. Now, there's no way she would have been able to access that text or, she could have, but it would have been pretty arduous and it wouldn't have been the enjoyment that she has and that she's grown. And, in Britain, I know, Deanna, you lived in Britain for quite a few years in England and taught there. Graphic novels are kind of, every kid gets like a Shakespeare graphic novel. It seems in England, like it's a standard issue.
That's there. Oh, the places you'll go.
Yeah, exactly. It's all the places they go. Yeah, perfect.
But you know, it's funny you bring up Dr. Seuss because it is funny that you bring up. I mean, let's think about this on the trajectory of the way that we learn to read, and when we are children, and some of the things that become touchstones for us are picture books and our specific authors that incorporate and intertwine their language with their pictography. I'm thinking Richard Scarry. I know that he's completely politically incorrect in some ways right now, but let me tell you, a Richard Scarry book is just embedded in each one of my children's memories as a primary means of being able to connect alphabetic text with image. I'm also looking at my 4-year-old shelf right now, and I'm thinking about Curious George. I'm thinking about H.A. Rey and the way that his visuals are so integral to the experience and the enjoyment of that text, and that I can't really, in my mind, think the words Curious George without seeing a little monkey wrapped in spaghetti sitting inside a pot. And while a chef in the background is looking alarmed. That we have these, and of course, Dr. Seuss, you brought up Dr. Seuss. We have these touchstones, these sort of our kind of primary memories of learning to read are typically very, very visual. And why we would want to abandon that and somehow elevate the experience of linear reading is really interesting to me.
Sorry, I was going to say, I think
linear,
it stems from that belief system that comic books are for kids. I think that's where because you get the same response when you say that I read picture books to my 6th and 7th graders every week. We are because they need the practice with the literary strategies.
Yes.
And a picture book is it's a whole slew of literary stuff in one 20-minute sitting. And so they don't have to wait weeks to get to the theme or, that kind of stuff. So I do a lot of picture books.
Yeah.
And that's
right in my reading intervention.
Yeah. And that's your reading intervention.
I did it with my
students that you
when I didn't teach reading intervention. I did it in my history class. I like pictures.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. And you also brought up, a really salient point at the beginning of the podcast is that, in all of our disciplines that we teach in middle school and high school, we count on using visuals, to help inform kids about the discipline and the content. So we do it like mad, of course, in subjects like social studies, history, science, but even something like mathematics that is graphically represented as well.
Yeah.
So, so I think that's a really prescient point. One of the things, let's do this for our viewers. It just dawned on me. Let's define what graphic novels are. I think some of our viewers may not know. So, we'll just kind of have a go around, if you had to describe graphic novels to a parent and what would you say?
I use the same term comic book for graphic novels and for comics. And so when I'm trying to explain it to people, a lot of people get hung up on the difference between graphic novels and comics. And really it's the difference between a TV show versus a movie, right? A graphic novel is a one-time sitting, whereas comic books come out weekly or monthly in serials. And so what I use when I'm describing comics is just, it's a pairing of text and panels of pictures that tell a story. And then anything else kind of falls into that broader umbrella for me, like graphic novels and manga. And I mean, I still call manga comic books because that's just Japanese comic books. And so, anything that has that picture panel storytelling combined, and they don't even necessarily have to have words. One of the most complex stories I've read is called The Story of Rex. And it's about a fox who gets abducted by aliens to pair with this alien fox to save a species. And there's not a single word in the entire comic.
Yes. And would you like my definition, Kate, or the way that I would describe it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think that's a great place to start. It's what does it look like? It is a text with words and pictures, and those texts and the text and the linear text, the alphabetic text, and the graphic text, the pictures complement and actually reinforce and build upon each other in order to tell a story. And I would go one step further, and I would say that for a novel to be considered a graphic novel or a comic text, it is incomplete without the addition of the visual media. That if you are only reading the alphabetic text, you're only actually getting half of the story, or even a quarter of the story, or in some case, none of the story. The higher literary and the higher analytical kinds of concepts that the author or authors are trying to convey are totally dependent upon visualization rather than linear alphabetic reading. So that's what I would say.
And the visualization, the graphics, I would add to it too. Yes, and the visuals are also about they're not a supplement; they're integral to telling the story.
Yes.
So we talk about text structures all the time in reading and how important those are, to develop reading skills and comprehension. And graphic novels have text structure to it. So just like we have to understand how a sonnet is a text structure and informs that text and is an integral part of the text, the meaning, what the poet is conveying, it is no different in a graphic novel.
Yeah.
So the next thing I'd like to do is let's talk about specific novels. All of us have kind of avid at-home readers. I always refer to it as the reading lab. I'll hand a book to. I used to have a Girl Scout troop, and when they were all in middle school and high school, I'm like, who wants to read this and give me a report on it and tell me if they like it, they would recommend it. And so I know you have a list that your son recommended, right, Deanna?
Well, I did. And it's as a kind of a litmus test. And I come back to this idea that, and I would like to speak about this later in the podcast and get Jen's thoughts on it. We've talked a lot about how struggling readers that graphic novels can be a great support for struggling readers, that they can be a great entry for non-engaged readers. And then there's a third level, I think, which was they allow really ambitious readers to actually access a whole new world of meaning and develop a whole new level of literacy. Well, my son would probably fall into that third category. And his preferred reading is graphic novels, I would say. Well, he goes back and forth, but he really does. And this is something that has led him to read every day, but also to draw every day. And I think this is very interesting how he journals. He journals and he draws pictures every day. And I would say that has something very, very, very basically linked to his love of graphic novels and his love of comic books, which started with
Asterix and
Tintin,
Obelix,
essentially, and started with Asterix, right?
I remember Tintin being so popular in your house.
Oh yeah, we've got the
Nobody
entire
knows
series,
about
of course.
Asterix and Obelix on this side of the country.
Yeah, go ahead.
I grew up watching Asterix and Obelix cartoons. One of the first comic books my husband bought me was he got me a Sleeping Beauty and an Asterix and Obelix.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, they're amazing.
No, and as I'm now with my 4-year-old, he's rediscovering them, and they're classics. They're absolute classics. Yeah. So, but anyway, so that's a child who began very much with reading comic books, who we never sort of censored our comic books. And so in some ways he has perhaps developed a taste that might be, I'm not going to recommend that every teenager go out and read these things. However, when I asked him this morning to give me recommendations of, say, 5 or 6 texts that he thinks everybody should read, I actually texted him with that question, and within 10 minutes, he had sent me back a list. And I thought that was so interesting because I thought, well, how often can you actually send a 16-year-old a text and have them respond immediately, for starters? And secondly, I was asking him for a favor. And third, I was asking him to reveal a piece of, of basically something that might be judged by me as a teacher. And he sent this list. He said, Mouse, Persepolis, Boxers and Saints.
It is a
Bone,
good list.
Watchmen, Epileptic. Just like that. He
it is. It's a very good list.
And it's a list that has 3 texts on it that I've never read before. And that he felt that he could tell me and convey to me. And I found myself, wow, suddenly I've got this relationship where I could pick up something that not only I've never read before, but that my son has some authority on, and I can be the learner in the situation. So that's what, we talked about. Yes, Katie, that's to answer your question.
his list is something that
for me,
I try to push about comic books so much, is when people say, oh, you read comic books, you know, I read Batman. I'm current on Batman. I was caught up in the whole Batman wedding fiasco that happened this summer. Like we're current. I read Batman. I read Spider-Man. I read, like, you know, I read the superheroes, but comic books are.
I have I'm sorry. I have a story about my husband that I'm going to have to convey.
Like, I'm reading a comic right now that's called Coda, that is a post-apocalyptic society, but that society was fantasy. So all magic has died, and now they're in the post-apocalypse.
Yes.
And so it's not a kid one. I would not recommend it for middle schoolers. Your son would probably really like it. It's amazing. But it hits you in those feelings. You know what I mean? Like, there's one that's we're reading called She Could Fly, that's about a girl who she's having like a psychotic break. And so you don't know what panels are real and what panels are in her head. And she's obsessed with this girl who would fly around the city, and then the girl just exploded one day. She was flying through the air and exploded, and nobody knows who she is, and nobody knows what's going on. And so this girl's obsessed with that, and also having kind of this psychotic break at the same time. So comic books are so much more than superheroes. And that list he gave is a good example of that. Like, Persepolis is supposed to be amazing.
Well, there's so many coming of age.
I haven't read that one yet, but it's supposed to be really good.
Yeah.
Oh, I've read that.
Yeah.
I read that when I was teaching at the university, and actually I taught the course of methods of teaching English in middle and high school, and I had a graphic novel class on that, and they were required to read Persepolis and Mouse. I required them to read it.
Yeah.
And we talked about the role of graphic novels. I thought I was like the really hip and progressive professor in this teacher preparation program, because that was like 12, 15 years ago. I started doing that. Yeah, that was a long time ago. But yeah, and Mouse was like, everyone was talking about it. It was just kind of brand new at the time. So Jenn, the other thing I want to mention, give you the opportunity to share with the audience, is that you and your husband, right, have a podcast on graphic novels as well. So
my
do you want to share with the audience, you know, what that is,
our
and
local
where they can find that?
And so comics really are every aspect of our house. But so his everybody that works here, there's a group of, I think, 6 or 7 that do AU radio. And so one of the podcasts is just AU radio, and it's more like nerd news. They talk about like who's coming up, what projects are coming, like, are there books, are there movies, it's not just comic books. But one of the segments that they always did was Comics Corner, and where they talked about like what's new this week, what's coming up, and so Comics Corner is just got expanded. They just shot their second podcast yesterday, where it's a full half an hour just talking about comics, and they pick some stuff that's brand new, like this is what came out this week. They tell you what's coming out next week, and then they also pick something older, like to do kind of a, hey, in case you missed this before, like check this one out. And so they're on Twitter under AU Radio.
Great.
They're on.
Yeah. Oh, that's
and then through iTunes.
So as we come to a closure on today's podcast on graphic novels, you know, Jenn, what advice would you give to parents and colleagues about incorporating graphic novels in their child or students' reading life?
I would say take sort of a cue from your child. Some of the best comics I have read have been on recommendations from kids. Like, they like Captain Underpants. And so a kid was like, you need to check out Dogman. I read it. It's adorable. It's like one of my favorites. So the kids tend to be a little vocal about what they want. I would also highly recommend you preview before you put anything in your classroom, and if you censor what your kids read, I would preview it and make sure, because sometimes just remember comics aren't just for children, and there's horror comics, there's comics that are rated R. And I just be open to trying new things. I read a comic this summer that was all about the plague, and it was told from the perspective of the bubonic plague. It's a science comic, so it was a ton of scientific information about the plague. They've got
I need that title. What's it called?
It's Science Comics Plague.
Science Comics Plague.
Yeah,
awesome.
Deanna's got kind of an obsession about the plague.
Oh, you need to check it out. It's so cool. Cause he's all mad because they've grown him in a lab. And so he wants out and he wants revenge.
I will definitely have to pick that one up. Oh, I'd be mad too if I were growing in a lab. Brought back from the medieval Middle Ages. Oh, I forgot to tell you.
So many.
Yes. Well, I am getting back to that, the story that I wanted to let you know about my husband. And I think that so much of what we do with literacy and trying to develop literacy is getting back to what we know works for kids and recognizing that what happens when you're a young child and what happens when you're an older child in terms of your effective response to experience of engagement isn't really all that different. Yeah. And that we should really think about what it is that worked, not to depart and leave behind something because somehow kids have outgrown something. And I wanted to tell this little story about my husband. My husband, who is a scientist who went on to become a physicist, when he was in kindergarten, was quite shocked because he found out that his kindergarten teacher's husband's name, or rather boyfriend's name, was Peter Parker.
Awesome.
And he will tell this story that he would lie in bed at night thinking about how he was going to tell Miss whatever her name was that she was that she was involved with someone who had a secret identity. And that
those are traumatic things for a kindergartner.
At the end of the school year, he went to her desk. He placed a copy of Spider-Man on her desk and said, Mrs. X or Ms. X, I think there's something you should know.
That's amazing.
And I walked away.
You know what? That is like the perfect story to end on.
That is amazing.
So I wanna thank Jenn for joining this crazy podcast. And for all that she does as far as like spreading the good news about graphic novels and comic books in classrooms and in young readers' lives. And the other thing too, on a side note, I've seen Jenn as a teacher. She's an amazing teacher over at Highlands Middle School in Kennewick, Washington. And it's a privilege to be her colleague.
Thanks.
So we're going to sign off.
If you my Twitter feed, all I post on my Twitter feed are pictures of my cats and reviews and screenshots of like graphic novels that I'm reading for recommendations. So that might be, if you are looking for ideas on specific books, that's what I do through my Twitter. And it's Jenn Marshall, JENNMARSHALLHMS for Highlands. But
Middle School. Okay. And we'll make sure to put that in the notes for the podcast, as well as the link to your other podcast, AU Radio too. So you can get all kinds of title ideas and inspiration regarding graphic novels. So we're signing off. I'm Katie McKnight with
Deanna Gallagher.
And we are the
Two Lit
Ladies.